Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith-Rogers. Today, we're bringing you a different sort of podcast. To be specific, an episode of Taplines, a VinePair podcast. Taplines tells stories of the history of the alcohol industry, while, as you know, Public Health on Call is all about public health. But then one day, our worlds collided. Taplines podcast host Dave Infante invited our own Dr. Josh Sharfstein to his podcast to talk about Four Loko, the popular caffeinated alcoholic drink from a decade ago. It turns out that Dr. Sharfstein served as the principal deputy commissioner of the FDA during the agency's analysis of the safety of the beverage and was very involved in the federal crackdown that wound up taking it off the market. What happens when an alcohol enthusiast meets a former federal regulator? Thanks to Taplines for letting us bring you this interview here. A link to the original podcast is in the show notes. Let's listen.
Hey, this is Dave Infante. Welcome to VinePair's Taplines, a weekly interview series with brewing icons, industry insiders, and outspoken experts about the United States' most beloved and best-selling beers. It's modern American history, one beer at a time. How old are you, Taplines listener? As we record this in June 2023, I'm 34, which means my senior year at college unfolded across 2009 and 2010. And that means I capped off my undergrad career drinking in the high-gravity heyday of original formula Four Loko. The infamous energy drink malt liquor hybrid hit university campuses across the country like an absolute freight train in the mid-aughts, delivering fruity flavor, serious ABV, and a kick of caffeine to America's youngest, most inexperienced drinkers. Known as a blackout in a can, it wasn't long before the chaos it wrought caught the attention of college administrators and state attorneys general, many of whom moved to ban it on the fairly obvious grounds that mixing uppers and downers is a recipe for disaster. But it wasn't until federal public health officials escalated their involvement in November 2010 that Four Loko's parent company pulled the drink off the market and reformulated it without the caffeine. You can still buy that drink today at a gas station near you, and via con Dios to you if you do. When Four Loko mania reached mainstream fever pitch in 2010, Dr. Joshua Sharfstein was serving as the principal deputy commissioner at the Food and Drug Administration. He joins Taplines today to tell a side of the story that got lost in the sauce for shitheads like me as the chaotic, cash-rich, caffeinated first act of Four Loko came to an unceremonious close. Namely, how the agency gathered the facts, determined its jurisdiction, and weighed its response to this hugely popular, highly volatile new drink. It's Dr. Joshua Sharfstein, it's Four Loko, it's the end of the original formula era, and it's all right here, right now, on VinePair's Taplines. Dr. Joshua Sharfstein, welcome to Taplines.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
Josh, where are you joining us from today?
I'm joining you from Baltimore, Maryland, from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where I teach in health policy and management.
Right on. Thank you again so much for joining us. Listeners, we've got a real treat in front of us here. As I queued up in the intro, you're going to be hearing from someone who was instrumental in sort of taking a close look at Four Loko in the late aughts and right around like November 2010, I think was the pivotal moment. And I think, Josh, the reason we wanted to have you on Taplines here today is because I think a lot of our listeners, and certainly I am personally, very familiar sort of with the narrative from the consumer side of things, but much less so from the public health side of things. And I think that's a key piece of the puzzle here and something that you have unique vantage to speak on because you were at the Food and Drug Administration during those years. And in 2010, you were the one who was part of the team that was leading the charge to review FDA's sort of role in what this beverage was and how it was interacting with the marketplace and make some tough decisions about whether it belonged there.
And can I just say that, I've in my career really supported transparency and regulatory decision making. So I'm happy to be here to talk about it. So people who may have just followed it as consumers maybe can learn a little bit more about what happened.
Totally. And we really appreciate it because, like I said, I think this is an important piece of the puzzle. So I'm glad to get into it. What in 2010 and I guess let's talk a little bit about your time at FDA. How long were you with the FDA?
So I started in 2009 with the Obama administration. I was involved in the transition team for FDA. And then I was appointed as the acting commissioner and then the principal deputy commissioner once Dr. Hamburg was the commissioner, got confirmed by the Senate. That happened, I think, in June, if I'm not mistaken, in 2009. So I was acting commissioner from March to June. And then I was principal deputy commissioner from there until I left to become the Maryland Health Secretary in 2011, at the beginning of 2011. Mm-hmm. And the story of caffeinated alcoholic beverages really starts in 2009, not 2010 when that kind of big news happened, but 2009 because we were getting concerns from different places about the safety of these products, which were really starting to become more popular.
Sure. So the caffeinated, I'm glad you brought up sort of the timeline there. Yeah, November 2010 is sort of the pivotal moment where FDA makes its position clear on Four Loko and a handful of other caffeine/alcohol beverages, and voices those concerns. And from there, of course, a lot of sort of consequences flow, both positive and negative, depending on your perspective.
My perspective is positive. I'll just say,
of course,
I'm going to be transparent about that from the beginning.
As well, you should. And frankly, I feel pretty positive about it too. I mean, having come up during that time and drank a bunch of Four Loko, the caffeinated stuff myself, I thought it was hot shit when I was 20, 21 years old. I look back on those times somewhat fondly, but also pretty relieved that those products are not available to me and pretty relieved that nothing terrible happened to me like it did to some drinkers at that time. So noted on that front, and certainly understand why you feel positively about it. As far as I'm concerned, I mostly do too.
Well, that's good to hear. So let me just tell you what it's like to be at the FDA. So much information is coming in from so many different sources. And the agency has enormous responsibilities. Most people know the agency for drug reviews or medical device reviews or vaccines. But of course, it's the Food and Drug Administration. So there's a lot of responsibility over food. Meat generally is the USDA, but most other foods, and believe it or not, some meats are under the jurisdiction of the FDA. And then we had also added tobacco products. So there was just a lot going on. And there are so many people who want to share information with the FDA. And the FDA has to be really thoughtful about how it approaches it. And you want to understand what's good information. There are multiple laws that govern the agency's actions. So it's rare that the agency will get something on a Monday and do something Monday afternoon.
Right.
It's not unheard of, but it's pretty rare. Usually it's going to be a pretty thoughtful process for the agency. And that's why I really say this starts, the story here starts really in 2009 as these concerns start coming in. And we get letters from a bunch of experts saying that they have concerns, and we get letters from a number of state attorney generals. And let me just tell you what the experts say. They say, hey, FDA, there's a product out there, or there's a set of products where people are adding caffeine to alcoholic beverages. And we're seeing three things. We're seeing that people are drinking more when they use these products. And that's just one thing.
Yep.
That they are not perceiving their level of intoxication because the caffeine is sort of revving them up. Typically, people, as they drink, might start to feel tired or, feel the level of the alcohol. But when you get these high doses of caffeine, they're not feeling it.
Sure.
And we're seeing that they're just as impaired, but they don't perceive it. So that's not a great thing. And then third, we're seeing greater consequences. We're seeing car accidents, sexual assaults, alcohol poisoning. And we think it's related to this concept of wide awake drunk, that people are not perceiving their level of intoxication. Those are pretty serious things. And at the time, if I'm not mistaken, the CDC also had those concerns. And the Centers for Disease Control is like a public health partner agency. Now, we got that information. We didn't run out and take a regulatory action. This sort of gets back to like we get information from a lot of places, and sometimes there are two sides of an issue. First thing we do is we look at, well, what's the legal ground that we're on here? And in this case, caffeine is considered a food additive. It doesn't come naturally in these alcoholic beverages, right? Four Loko does. There's no spring of Four Loko that has caffeine and everything else in it.
Not that we've discovered, at least.
Yeah, right.
Hopefully not.
Yeah. So someone's got to add the caffeine, and that suddenly engages a law that the FDA enforces that has to do with food additives. And a food additive can be generally recognized as safe, or else it has to be approved by the FDA. So, there's another couple legal provisions that didn't apply. So question is it generally recognized as safe or not? And now we have experts writing us and saying it is harmful. It's not just generally recognized as safe, it is harmful.
We've got empirical evidence saying, hey, we're seeing this happen, and these are credible information streams that are coming into the FDA.
These are published papers. These are, academic researchers. And so we still, so clearly there's a legal basis for FDA involvement, and there are very credible concerns coming in. What we did next was in November 2009, FDA wrote a whole bunch of companies, every company we could find that manufacture these. And we said, we want to know if you think this is generally recognized as safe. And if so, on what basis did you reach that conclusion? So before the FDA would conclude it's not generally recognized as safe and therefore illegal without an approval, we asked whether they had evidence that it's generally recognized as safe. And we sent those letters in November 2009. There was a fair amount of publicity to that too, where we expressed some concern and we said, hey, we've heard different kinds of concerns. We want to know what you think, companies that are making this,
Right.
And that was a pretty important step, I think, for people to realize our level of concern, and also for the companies to have a fair chance to say, actually, we think it's safe.
Yep. Right. And that's sort of like the basics of, obviously, like I'm in the journalistic discipline, in the public health discipline. Like there are sort of the idea is that, okay, you get information. There might be two sides of the story, but now you have to challenge like the baseline assumption that's out in the marketplace. And now it becomes the responsibility of the producers who are profiting off of these products. If they have good rationale, FDA wants to hear them, but that's when you go out and do that fact finding. Like, okay, tell us where you're coming from, because right now where we're coming from is that this stuff sounds pretty bad. Read us in on what you're seeing on your end, Mr. Producer.
Right, and those letters explain the legal standard, explain what we were looking for, ask for information. I don't recall we got that much, if anything, from the companies, but we might have gotten something, and we would have read it very carefully. And then we took the next step. That's what happened in November 2010. So it took a whole year of review looking at, and, FDA looked at any other data that it could find.
Yep.
The scientists at FDA to try to make the best decision here. Is there evidence that this is generally recognized as safe? Is this generally recognized as safe? Or would it require an application, in which case it's being marketed illegally? And the FDA took the next step. And to understand what it did is it actually didn't order them off the market. Sometimes there's a little confusion about that.
Tell me more about that, though.
FDA took the next step, which is called a warning letter. And a warning letter basically says, okay, we think that there's a problem here under the law. And you have, I think, maybe 14 days or something like that to respond. And if, this may precede enforcement action. Right. But this itself is not enforcement action of the same type. And so that's what happened in November. And if I recall, we did that we announced that in a press conference where we had a couple of state attorney generals there. We had the CDC explaining its concerns about the products. They were talking about the evidence. And we had the Tobacco and Tax Bureau as well, which oversaw the products. And
formula and labeling,
Yeah. And when we released those warning letters, that's when, if I'm recalling correctly, the Tobacco and Tax Bureau said that they didn't think it had the requisite safety assurance to be able to be marketed. I may not be getting the legal standard exactly right. And that led them to be withdrawn. Because we were expressing concern at that point, other laws, other authorities kicked in, and that's what happened. But we, in that letter, noted what was in the scientific literature, The combined ingestion of caffeine and alcohol may lead to hazardous and life-threatening situations because caffeine counteracts some, but not all of alcohol's adverse effects.
Mm-hmm.
And so we kind of laid out the concerns that we had that shouldn't have been a surprise to companies because we'd written them a year before. And we did think that it was not generally recognized as safe. That standard is really for things that are generally recognized as safe. And we couldn't look ourselves in the mirror and say adding, large amounts of caffeine to alcohol, given this evidence, was safe.
Sure. Josh, I want to, in terms of the FDA's perspective, this story, as you made the point, starts in 2009. You start receiving these information sort of streams from credible sources, state attorneys general, other public health authorities. And that's when you first start looking into it. The story for caffeinated alcoholic, mostly malt liquor, that's what these base products are, right? And then they have caffeine added to them. The story in terms of the marketplace starts a little bit earlier. Four Loko hits the market in 2005, I think. It struggles a little bit to get traction at first. They reformulate, they upped the ABV. It starts to attract more attention. They were kind of a fly-by-night player at the time. This is, I think the parent company is called Fusion Labs LLC. They're out of Chicago. They still are around. But at the time, this is like these three guys from Ohio. They're like frat brothers. And, they sort of famously, as part of their marketing shtick are like, we're our target market. Like we want, to drink this stuff. So there are fringe players in the beverage alcohol space that do all sorts of stupid stuff that the bigger guys don't do. But I think it's important to remember that in that decade, right around the same time, the biggest players in American beer were also marketing caffeinated alcoholic beverages. Anheuser-Busch had Tilt, I think it was called, and in Molson Miller Coors, I guess it wasn't Molson Coors yet. Miller Coors was marketing something called Sparks, which I drank when I was in college. We used to do, this will horrify you as a public health expert, but we used to make these things called Sporties, where we would drink half of a 40 of Old English and then pour a 16 ounce of Sparks into that bottle and mix it up, and then it became a Sporty, a Sparks 40. They had these products out on the market as well. And so we're not just talking about fringe players. I think Four Loko sort of becomes, fast forward to 2010 and Four Loko is by that point the most prominent caffeinated alcoholic beverage on the market and has this sort of tremendous pop cultural aura around it. But the big guys were dabbling in this space as well. That does not validate it at all, of course. That doesn't mean that they're on the right side of things just because AB and Miller Coors are. But it's really this bizarre moment where every player across the breadth of beverage alcohol producers is looking for, oh man, maybe this is the next move. Maybe caffeinated alcoholic beverages are the next move, And as the information streams start to come in and the state attorneys general start to take a look at things, you see the big guys move quickly to reformulate. They have a very low appetite for risk. They're big, diversified CPG companies. They're enormous legal targets for class action lawsuits. Miller Coors and AB are like, okay, cool, got it. No more. Four Loko forges ahead, lower to the ground, certainly, and much more fly by night. And if they have a legal department, it's one guy, maybe from Ohio State Law School or whatever, one of their buddies, who knows what it is at the time. But companies like that typically are willing to take more risk right up until the point when they run into an enforcement mechanism or a regulator with enough sort of authority and credibility that they find it too scary to proceed.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying with the exception of I wouldn't cast aspersions on the Ohio State Law School.
No, that's not fair enough. That's actually not really what I meant. I more meant they might have a buddy who they were in other words, they don't have, a better way to phrase it is they don't have a
maybe
phalanx.
The best legal advice was not coming in to that.
Yes, or it's right, exactly. It's not a phalanx of corporate lawyers the way Miller Coors or Anheuser-Busch has in their compliance departments. That's the way those companies are built.
At FDA, we're not doing a complex market analysis to kind of understand what's going on. I think we're looking for things that are important to do, though. We don't want to do something that is really just a very, very marginal importance when there's so many different things we could be spending our time on. I think in this respect, the request from the state attorneys general was pretty significant.
Carried a lot of weight.
If you get Democrat and Republican attorneys general, it was bipartisan, saying you've got a new product, it's under your jurisdiction, we're very concerned about it, it's growing. We're going to we're going to pay more attention to that compared to something where nobody's writing us and, somebody just maybe sees it in a store somewhere.
Or a local news story or something. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so, all that's happening like you're describing, and, it may not be getting to the FDA, but it kind of percolates up through the state attorneys general. And then they come en masse to the FDA and say, what are you guys going to do about this?
Yeah.
And at the same time, we're hearing from scientists that there are these particular risks. And that led us to actually open this kind of regulatory review that led ultimately to the warning letters.
Yep. And listener, you should know that when Dr. Sharfstein says en masse, it really is en masse. In my notes here, I think it was 24 state attorneys general ultimately were involved in voicing concern around this, or at least more than that. I think here in my notes, I say 24 states attorneys general initiate investigations into Fusion Project's marketing of Four Loko. So we're talking about, half of the country, the top law enforcement officer in almost half of the states are looking hard at this beverage.
Yeah, and I do remember it was bipartisan. I think there was a Republican attorney general in Iowa, if I'm not mistaken, who was particularly outspoken. And, it's our job to pay attention to that.
Yep.
It's not our job to do what they say, but it's our job to pay attention and do a, serious review, which is what we did initiate.
Sure. And in addition to the state attorneys general, obviously that carries a lot of weight. But another thing that was going on at the time, because this was a relatively affordable, bang for buck way to get very drunk very fast. I mean, one of the sort of slang terms for it was a blackout in a can, or chaos in a can, you'd hear people call it. Obviously, a nexus for that type of binge drinking in the U.S. happens on college campuses. And so colleges at this time were also individually had started to take action against Four Loko specifically. You had University of Rhode Island, Central Washington University, Ramapo, Worcester State, all of these schools individually, absent, federal regulation or state level regulation, are already moving to ban it from campus, to do education campaigns around that product specifically. So it's not just a matter of, folks in the state house in 24 different, states who are worried about it. It's administrators on the ground at universities who are seeing the consequences up close on, Friday nights and Saturday nights and whatever.
Right.
They're seeing, again, that empirical evidence of what happens.
Can be really horrible consequences. Kids can die from alcohol poisoning. That happens. And not to mention car accidents, sexual assaults, all kinds of things can happen. And colleges, don't want to see those things happen to their students. I think I remember a story, and, this was just something that came our way, not something that necessarily played any role in this, but the story about a party at a college where they gave 2 cans to each kid who showed up and told them that they had to drink them before they could come in,
Right.
and these cans are big,
24
and
ounces.
They have a lot, right? So I think, and maybe you could remind me, but I think each one has the equivalent of 4 beers of alcohol.
Sure. It's 24 ounces at 11%, I think was the standard ABV. So you're talking about what you would call a low ABV wine. That's almost a bottle of low ABV wine in one 24-ounce can.
And so they were being asked to drink 2.
Right.
So, and then you got all that caffeine, and it was a lot of caffeine.
Yep.
And so that was just not a good setup, and kids were getting sick before they could even get into the party,
Right.
And, multiply that by multiple places, college campuses, and you could see why, there were real serious concerns justified by actual injuries that we were looking at the time.
Yeah, and definitely not to downplay what those, injuries look like. There were a couple fatalities that, again, I know from your perspective, it's probably a little bit difficult to say exactly if there's a death, exactly what causes it. But Four Loko is included in or involved in several really awful, fatalities right around this time as well. There was I think a cardiac arrest of an 18-year-old kid. We're just looking at, you're hearing about this stuff. And this was, it was being reported at the time. It was a real thing. These weren't just apocryphal stories. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of impulse to make light of this and, oh, kids are being kids. And again, like I was 20 and 21 at the time, and I was certainly partaking in this. I don't want to sort of like look down my nose at this as though I was not, participating. And frankly, I think I enjoyed it at the time. I think I got a huge kick out of it. Both literally and figuratively, I suppose, with the caffeine. But that's not to say that even contemporarily, even as a 21-year-old, I was aware of these things at the time. I just didn't. I didn't care nearly as much.
Well, I mean that's developmentally normal. I mean,
thank you.
I'm a pediatrician. Adolescents are known for not really caring that much about the consequences of things, as much as people tend to do later. And that's just their brain developing in a way. And that's why it's important to have some protections and not to have products that are particularly unsafe, in my view, available. And here there was a very clear law and a very clear risk. And that's why the FDA saw this as an action that was in support of public health.
Mm-hmm. Josh, by late 2010, right around the time, sort of we reached the point where FDA chooses to issue that warning letter that you described earlier. By 2010, Oklahoma, Michigan, Utah, Oregon, New York, and Washington, the states have banned Four Loko in one form or another. In New York, I think the Wholesalers Association, so beer distributors, have basically decided it's bad for business because they're worried about potential liability coming back on them, and decide that they're just not going to do this, which of course in the United States, 3-tier system basically, almost destroys Four Loko's route to market in that state. So there's already sort of a groundswell of, we mentioned the colleges earlier, and then you got states banning it. I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about how you're thinking about this at the time at FDA, why it's important for, you might look at that and say, well, look, like states that think this is a big significant risk in their population are already taking action on this. They're aware of the risks and there's a process for that at the state level. Why in your mind at FDA at the time, is it important for FDA to come out and take that action, take that warning letter?
Yeah. States are responsible for health, really, in a lot of different ways under the U.S. system. And states are often taking all kinds of different actions that they think are appropriate for health. It's easier in some states to do that than others, based on the legal structure and other things that exist in different states. And on almost everything that FDA works on, there can be some related state activity. The FDA's responsibility is for the country, and its goal and mission has to do with advancing and protecting public health for the nation. And so we look at it as a national question. We feel responsible for young people in every state. And so the fact that some states are taking action demonstrates the severity of the situation, but doesn't dissuade us necessarily from doing something that we think is important to do and we have the clear legal authority to do, which we did in this case. And so sometimes, FDA will come out before anyone else does things, but that's pretty rare. Usually there's almost always some state that jumped out ahead while FDA is thinking about it. And that's partly because when the states are acting, it's often through the legislative process. The legislative process can be just, a bill that comes up and it just happens to be during the legislative session and it passes and boom, it's in effect. When FDA is doing something, it's going to be very thoughtful because it's got to apply the standards of the law that exists, and that can take a little bit more time. In this case, there's no question that other states would have followed suit, at some point. But when we had the evidence that we felt necessary to move forward, we did move forward. And this was not a case of the FDA closing the barn door after the animals had already left. There were definitely some states that were worried but hadn't gotten there, didn't know their path, and were really looking to FDA for action. So, in the end, I think we wanted to do, what was right for public health.
When you talk about that evidence, obviously you've got a lot of this info coming in from these credible sources. We spoke about that earlier in the episode. In a case like this, or I guess in this specific case, was FDA conducting like trials of the product? Like, was there like a situation? I know a lawmaker at one point in New York, for example, drank a Four Loko under, doctor supervision to sort of gauge the effects on his blood pressure, on whatever, in order to demonstrate how averse of an effect it could have. Was FDA conducting like trials like that? Is that not part of the purview? Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, and obviously it would be possible to invent ideas for trials. Mm-hmm. You could do that. Almost any question that comes up, you could do more studies.
Right.
So this relates a little bit to how the law is structured and the legal burden. That oftentimes FDA has to make decisions under uncertainty. If you think back about the COVID vaccines, which saved millions of lives around the world and many, many, many lives in the United States, there were some great studies done. Fantastic studies. So then people say, like, well, how come you don't have 5 years of safety data? Well, then you'd have to wait 5 years.
Right.
But we know a lot about safety. We know enough that it's very clear that the benefits exceed the risks. And that's why the vaccines, were authorized. So in this case, we had a lot of evidence. We didn't have every possible piece of evidence. We had a lot of evidence. And the standard here, the burden, is really on the company. If you're going to add a chemical to food, you have to believe it's safe.
Yeah,
that's how the law is structured. And we gave them the chance to tell us what evidence they had, to justify that. And so, that's pretty much how we wound up thinking of it.
Yeah, it didn't seem necessary to go further when you have all of these stories from credible sources. You know the effects of caffeine and the effects of alcohol, and you have public
scientific studies, multiple published scientific studies, experts telling us. And the standard is this generally recognized as safe?
Right.
Well, does anyone recognize this as safe? I mean, there wasn't any, was there a credible source saying, wait, this is really safe? We didn't find one serious credible source doing that. Meanwhile, we have all these credible sources saying it's unsafe. It's not just not generally recognized as safe. So for the standard that we had and what we thought was appropriate for the public health, we have plenty of evidence to make that decision.
I want to ask about one of the things that Four Loko's founders said, sort of once they find themselves in this situation, or once they find themselves in the public eye. They had been in this situation for a while, but once the media starts taking like real note of this and looking at it more closely, one of the defenses that they make, for their product is, I'm just going to quote here from a Fusion Labs statement. Quote, if our products were unsafe, we would not have expected the federal agency responsible for approving alcoholic beverage formulas, the Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, to have approved them. Yet all our product formulas and packaging were reviewed and approved by the TTB before being offered to consumers, close quote. Now, I cover the beer industry. I have an appreciation just because I've covered it for this long. I'm aware of the difference in swim lanes, but the rank and file American drinker is not, by and large. Can you elucidate what maybe is missing from that framing of sort of like federal responsibility there? Why does FDA have entree here, even though TTB did allow Four Loko to market with, because they approved the label and they approved the formula? What's the distinction there? What's the nuance?
And eventually TTB pulled that back. In 2010. There are different laws, and sometimes there's more than one law that applies. And in this case, there's a food additive law that applied, and that is overseen by FDA. And so I think TTB took the position that if they don't hear that there's a problem, then they're not, that's not their view. They'll look at the, just the what's in the application or make sure the label is accurate.
Yep.
But as soon as they heard there's a problem from FDA, they acted. And from the company's perspective, companies have to think about the FDA because that's the law that applies to the safety of their products. And the law says if you're going to do a food additive, it has to be generally recognized as safe, or you have to file an application. And if you are going to declare it's generally recognized as safe, you need to have data on hand to support that. And so, that's why we asked them for that data. And so the law applied. So, the law caught up to them, basically.
Sure. Another thing that was put forward both by Four Loko's founders and other stakeholders from the supplier side, from the beverage alcohol production side, as well as the American drinking public, who is in thrall to this, to some extent, to this caffeinated alcoholic beverage, was, and I'm paraphrasing here, well, I mean, Red Bull vodka, I drink that at the bar. Irish coffee, we've been drinking that for years. What's the difference?
Sure. People are allowed to mix things. I mean, there's no law that governs what foods you can mix together. But when something is packaged and sold and marketed, that is the risk is much higher. And you see that by all the concerns that we got from, the attorneys general, the campuses, and, the scientists. And so you have a clear law, again, that says this is what we do about food additives. Now, people can, mix something in their basement and drink it for themselves. But to be able to package it, market it, sell it, that's a food, and if you have a food additive in that food, there's a law that applies to that for a reason.
Yep.
And I think part of that reason is the harm is magnified tremendously when you can market a complete product.
Totally. And that makes total sense, even from the drinker perspective. If I think about it for a second, right, and I have, but for people who sort of view that as a compelling argument, I would urge you to think about the idea of like, all right, you want a Red Bull vodka? You need a place to go buy both of those things. You need a place to pour them into a cup. So you need a cup. You need a place to consume that, probably not while you're walking around, right? Because there's open container laws and it's not easy to brown bag an open cup of beverage. Flip side is, I think by the time Four Loko gets pulled in 2010, not gets pulled, let me correct myself, they choose to, quote, voluntarily reformulate. They say they lose 80,000 points of distribution overnight because they've chosen to take their product off the market following FDA's warning letter. 80,000 points of distribution. That's so many places to buy Four Loko that you cannot walk into and buy a Red Bull vodka. You can't even walk into every bar and buy a Red Bull vodka. Plenty of them don't market that. Like, they don't sell that.
There's one other thing which I think is important, which is there are a lot of surveys that indicate that when people see something for sale, they think that at some level it's okay.
Yes. Yeah, sure.
And that's true for all kinds of different regulated products. Like, if there were a big problem with this, somebody would have taken it off the market.
Right.
Kind of the attitude. And so there's a kind of tacit approval if it's just for sale, and whereas if something's mixed together, people know they're doing it.
Right. Right.
They're adding the things together. They're responsible. Nobody's, saying this is, a safe product.
Yep.
That's something that they're doing for themselves rather than an implicit, assumption of safety that may come from having a fully packaged product that way.
There's no imprimatur of like a clean, well-lit supermarket where there's stuff on the shelves and gosh, like this is clearly like a legitimate, sort of marketplace versus, if you're at the dive bar, man, like, you're watching someone mix it up in front of you and you know what one is and you know what the other is. And, you're kind of on your own.
Yeah. And I think that that's borne out ultimately. I know we'll talk about what happened afterwards,
yes.
But, there was not like, that I'm aware of, a surge in Red Bull and vodka related problems.
No.
That was in any way the scale of what was going on with Four Loko.
No, I'm not aware of that either. And, this being a beer podcast, some listeners will know why. And for those that don't, I'll spell it out real quick. 70 to 80% of beer is sold through grocery. You're talking about a tremendous volume, fire hose of a way to get product to market. There are dramatically fewer places to drink on premise in a bar than there are to buy alcoholic beverages at retail and take them home or take them wherever and drink them other. Additionally, there are far fewer liquor stores for foolproof spirits than there are places to buy beer. So all of these things are sort of conspiring to, if not, destroy the market for Red Bull vodka, hinder it in such a way that it can never explode in the way that Four Loko did.
Well, I never really appreciated that. So I appreciate hearing that. And I had the experience, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I had the experience previously to when I worked at FDA. I was the health commissioner of Baltimore. And there was a product that was over-the-counter cough and cold medicines for kids. Mm-hmm. All right, like you would get it for the cold or cough runny nose of a little baby.
Sure.
And those products had never been demonstrated to be safe, and there were kids getting into trouble. They were getting multiple doses from different parents, and some of them were dying. Not a large number, but some of them, and there was no benefit. So those were all unnecessary deaths.
Mm-hmm.
And we petitioned to take them off the market. And they eventually came off the market for kids under age 4. And some people were saying, okay, this is what's going to happen. You're going to take off the version that has the dropper, and now parents are going to be giving it by teaspoon. They're going to be giving the adult medicines to kids, and you're going to make things worse because, you wind up with worse substitution when you take a product where the benefit risk ratio isn't that good off the market. It's only going to get worse. Well, we had evidence about what happened. It did come off the market for under 4. There wasn't evidence of safety and effectiveness for those products. And it turned out the calls to poison control dropped dramatically, and I said, at the time, I'm a pediatrician, that I don't think parents are trying to harm their kids. I think that these products, when they're marketed, parents think they're safe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They're not dying to give their kids adult medicines.
Right.
They're looking for safe medicines for their kids. And that, I think, turned out to be true. I wasn't 100% sure, but that was my intuition. And with the benefit of time, we could see that actually the poisonings went down and ER visits went down for poisonings. There are multiple sources of data showing a huge improvement. And I think it's exactly this issue you're talking about. When something's packaged and very available, people think, well, it's easy to get.
Right.
If there were problems, somebody would have not let me do this.
Right.
And it is the FDA's job when there are products that really don't make sense to take them off the market when they're really causing a lot more harm than good.
I think that's a fantastic segue for what I want to talk about briefly before I let you go. And by the way, thank you so much for your time and candor to this point. But let's turn our attention now, Josh, to what happens in the immediate aftermath of FDA issuing that warning letter to Four Loko. And by the way, listener, it also went to, I think, 3 or 4 other companies, 7 products in total. You may remember Juice, Joose, was the other big one. It was sort of a Four Loko knockoff. But there were a handful of others. So Four Loko was not the only one. It was by far the most prominent. FDA issues the warning letter November 17th, 2010, I believe. At the very same time, concurrently, Four Loko comes out and says they're going to voluntarily reformulate the product. And that's a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. You can hear the sarcasm in my voice, listener. They are volunteering to not run into more stiff regulatory attention in the future. The writing is on the wall. FDA is moving methodically and it believes, with the full force of the law behind it, but everyone kind of knows where this is headed. And Four Loko,
I think the Tobacco and Tax Bureau did take an action also, or did announce a different kind of policy that probably hastened that along too.
I think you're right. I believe that TTB put their labels under review, which makes it so, again, writing is on the wall there. It's got to happen. So Fusion Labs does basically the only move it can do if it wants to stay in business and says, all right, we're reformulating, we're doing this, all that. So we've talked up to this point about the public health sort of, perspective on this and the legal mandate that FDA has and the way you're gathering information. And you're representing the expertise in the public health community at that time and here on the podcast, and we really appreciate it. Let me represent the shithead perspective in 2010, the heavy drinking, heavy user, white male, Four Loko consumer. I remember and this is backed up by news reports at the time, this is not just anecdotally, a absolute consumer panic, not over, oh my God, we've been drinking this dangerous thing, we're all in trouble. Oh my God, we got to go buy as much caffeinated Four Loko off the shelves and stockpile it because the feds are taking it from us. Now, I'm sure that's annoying to hear, and I'm sure you've heard it before, but what I wanted to ask you about with the context of that story you just told about the cough and cold medicine, there's a knock-on effect that you are thinking about, I'm guessing, but I want to hear how you're thinking about it and how you're thinking about it in the case of Four Loko. You know that when FDA takes action, there are going to be marketplace effects. One of them might be that morons like me at 21 or, whatever, decide, well, actually, forget about that. I'm more worried about securing access to this product as long as I can in the future, and I'm going to go buy more of it. Yeah. My question to you, Josh, is how were you thinking about that potential knock-on effect at the time? Because,
Yeah.
you had to
Not
see it
too
coming.
much.
Not too much.
Not too much. I mean, I think we were warning people, and there were all kinds of warnings from CDC about the dangers of the products.
Yeah.
Now I take your point. The dangers may not be penetrating every population, but at the same time, that's our responsibility.
Yeah.
And it's much safer for a product not to be available over the long term, even if people are going to buy a little bit more of it in the short term. And there's only so much in the supply chain. If I recall, I think Four Loko had to convert some of its inventory to auto fuel at some point that they couldn't, like ethanol.
No, come on, really? I don't remember that.
Yeah. In fact, if you don't believe me,
I believe you. I just
on my desk. I don't know if you can read this. It says Four Loko. Let's see if I can hold this up.
Yep, there it is. So, listener, we've got Four Loko converted to auto fuel, recycling plant in Abingdon, Virginia.
Began turning truckloads of Four Loko and other alcohol-laced energy drinks into ethanol after federal authorities cracked down on the sale of beverages last year. So not everything turned out to have been consumed.
Well, look at that. A nice sustainable green transition for Four Loko. That is hilarious, by the way, that you have that on your desk. Clearly, I mean, what a
little souvenir.
Yeah, why not, right? At the time, Four Loko, the company winds up with about $30 million worth of product that they can't sell because, again, like they're reformulating. TTB says no more.
They might have sold it as ethanol,
so it might have been some of it might have become fuel for your automobile. That is not a ringing endorsement for something that legal drinking age and underage drinkers had been pouring down their throats for the last 6 years, but a happy ending nonetheless because it was converted to some use besides blacking out people like me. Dr. Sharfstein, thank you so much for joining us on Taplines. We've gone the distance here, and I just really appreciate you joining to tell this side of the story. I mean, it's 2023. We are 13 years removed. And when we emailed Dr. Sharfstein, he responded almost immediately and he said, yeah, I'm down. And, I'm happy to come on. And the transparency you've shown here, I think is vital. I mean, again, like drinkers at the time were distraught. People, young drinkers feel like the feds were taking some from, but getting this side of the story and understanding the way that you proceeded here is really, I think, vital and exactly what we're trying to do on Taplines. So thank you again so much.
I appreciate the evolution of your thinking as you've described it. And I hope some of those people who might look back and have been very angry might realize that they might be alive today in the most extreme example, but also they may have avoided some tragedies in their lives or some legal jeopardy for themselves because they were not consuming a product that was particularly harmful to them. And so now one of the things about public health is like, nobody really knows if that was them. It's not like we're doing surgery and they know exactly who was saved by this. But I know that there are people out there who their lives are in their trajectory that they wanted. They were not knocked off their life's trajectory by an automobile accident, by an accusation or an actual assault that they suffered or committed. That all these things that happen, those things didn't happen. People are able to live their lives, including some of the people who might be listening and going like, I don't know if I agreed with that. I just hope some people might think it's possible that in an alternate universe, their lives would have been much worse because of these products. And that's really what the FDA is about, balancing these things, doing a thorough review, listening to scientists, looking at evidence, and making decisions that hopefully will advance public health.
Taplines is recorded in Richmond, Virginia, and produced by yours truly and Darby Seaside, who, along with the talented Shane Farrick, composed our delightful soundtrack. Just listen to it. I also want to give a quick shout out to the entire VinePair team, and especially co-founders Adam Teeter and Josh Mallon, editor-in-chief Joanna Sciarrino, managing editor Tim McCurdy, and art director Danielle Grinberg, who designed our lovely Taplines logo. And of course, a big thank you to you, yes, you listener, for spending time with us week in and week out. We literally couldn't do this without you. I'm Dave Infante, and I'll catch you next time.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Philip Porter, Spencer Greer, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez and Shian Briscoe. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.